almost every church out there probably has some old guy who loves building things, in his garage. And most of those old guys, not all, but most of those old guys would love it if the 12, 13, 14-year-old boys in the church were brought over to learn how to build with them. And so I would say, looking around at your church community, your school community, and say, okay, because this is the other thing Thomas will always talk about is that apprenticeship in the trades, mentorship in the trades, is one of the most powerful ways of men teaching boys what it is to be a man. And so when I say trades, and I'm thinking here broadly, not necessarily vocationally, but the old guy who loves woodworking in his garage, he has an opportunity to invite boys and young men into that, and then through working together to help confer a sense of mature manhood onto young men.
Father Mark Perkins, welcome to the show. Please tell us just a little bit about yourself for our audience who might not remember the last podcast that we did.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's always good to chat with you, and thanks for having me back. Father Mark Perkins. I'm the chaplain and assistant headmaster of St. Dunston's Academy, a job that I think I had just taken when we spoke last. Although I was still at that time the curate down at St. Albans Anglican Church in Oviedo, Florida, where I was for 3 years. Before that, I taught for 9 years in Charlottesville, Virginia. So now I'm helping launch a farm trades and boys school in Central Virginia on a 176-acre farm in the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it. I'm very curious about St. Dunstan's Academy, the vision behind it, how it kind of was conceived as an idea that's now being made a reality. So tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a lot of origin stories, if you will, a lot of different sort of threads that came together. I'm kind of the second guy, the co-founder, if you will. But the true founder, Thomas Fickley, is on a roof just outside there. We're building our second dorm, and Thomas is, in addition to being our headmaster and founder, he's a licensed commercial builder. St. Dunstan's Academy is the only high school, or the only school, period, I think, in the Commonwealth of Virginia that owns its own building license as an institution. So we're doing our own building under our own license. And so if you hear some background noise, that's our big telehandler moving. We're putting insulation on the roof of our dorm right now. So, but Thomas, to make a long story short, I suppose, Thomas found out that he was finishing a master's degree in the history with a thesis on the history of American educational philosophy. And the semester that he was finishing that up, he found out that his wife, Natalie, was pregnant with twin boys, 4 and 5. And he started to think maybe God was calling him to think seriously about the education of boys. In the meantime, he at the time was teaching at a boarding school in Central Virginia. I was teaching at a day school. We went to church together. And we talked a lot about the challenges of schooling in contemporary America. And I was at a really good school. His school was mixed. We ended up teaching together at the same very good day school for a year, and we had a great curriculum. We had a great leadership in our school. We had really good faculty. We had families that were mostly on board, kind of pulling in the same direction, and we found that the sort of tangible results of all those good things working together were not as that our students were not as free from the kind of general vices and acedia and problems in the broader culture and anxieties as we would have expected. So it seemed like to a certain extent, the culture of the school was still dominated by pop culture. And so part of what we were doing is thinking, all right, if that's true, if we're sort of farming on rocky soil, that soil being the culture that dominates the school in spite of all these good things, then what would it look like to build a school with a different culture oriented in a different direction? So we were asking that question alongside the question of what would a school for boys look like if you didn't take anything for granted, if you didn't assume that it had to be done one particular way. And so the sort of outcome, I would say, of those lines of inquiry was St. Dunstan's Academy, through a series of it wasn't direct. Part of it was a friend also put a book called John Senior and the Restoration of Realism by Father Francis Bethel into his hands. John Senior is a massively important educational reformer out of the Roman Catholic Church in 1970s, who's had a great impact. And Thomas looked around, he said, who's doing something like this? And found a couple of Roman Catholic schools that were on a sort of John Senior model out there, but nothing in the Anglican world, and really nothing outside of these two small Roman Catholic boarding schools that, and said, I think something along inspired by the same vision should exist for Anglicans and for others in the church as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. As a classical educator myself, that is one of the things that I've noted, is that despite the beauty of classical education, without any real culture surrounding that's intentional, a lot of these kids are still inundated with the pop culture and are essentially living in a secular world and living secular lives with a sprinkling of truth, goodness, and beauty, so to speak. How do you think we ended up in that place where there's such a disconnect between what I would say true education should look like and the actual culture that should kind of undergird that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a big question. I can't remember who. So somebody said, Thomas always gives this quote. So somebody who originated this can let us know that culture eats curriculum for breakfast. You can have a great curriculum, but your school culture is really defines what you're able to do, and that culture is a combination, a product of the family cultures of the students who come, the faculty culture. I think that's one of the most important things, that the culture of the faculty themselves. So not just what they're teaching in the classroom, and not even the individual friendships, but what do when the faculty gather together, what do they talk about? And I will say again, that was one of the wonderful things about the day school where I taught in Charlottesville, is that actually the faculty culture was really strong. There was we had meaningful conversations and deep friendships among the faculty. It's also the culture of the churches that they're coming out of. But one of the ways that we say it is that although each of those has a voice into the culture of the school, but all the volume of all of those voices combined is not as loud as Taylor Swift, is kind of one of the ways that we put it, is that pop culture is just so loud and so overwhelming that in most school contexts, it's very difficult to be heard over pop culture, over the sort of pop culture that's out there. And so one of the things we say is we're not trying to take boys out of the culture. That wouldn't be possible, and it wouldn't really be desirable either. What we're trying to do is we're trying to send men, well-equipped, well-formed young men, into the culture, into the broader world. But in order to form them, we have to at least turn the volume down on the sort of pop culture influences out there. And so that's kind of the vision for what we want to do, is turn that volume down. So I think part of it is just that day schools, any school in general, you're always combating what is the sort of defining culture that the school is within. I actually had a piece out a few days ago at North American Anglican and American Reformer. It was cross-posted, called Joshua Against Pacifism, and the original title was Joshua Against Culture War Pacifism. And you can read it. There's lots of nuances in there, but one of the claims that I make is that you cannot love your neighbor and be indifferent to the culture. And so not to get ahead of it, but the argument is that culture warring, such as it is always third order. That you have a responsibility to root sin and death out of your own heart, and then you have a responsibility to do good unto the brethren, unto the church. And that third is the polis, the sort of broader culture, the broader political community that any given church and any given individual is within. It's third order, but it's also still necessary. And so I think in a lot of ways we have a kind of sick, incoherent culture that we live in. And we also say, this is my most negative, that is the most negative piece I've published in my St. Dunstan's career. We said a couple of years ago we were going to be for things, not fundamentally against things. So I'm sorry that I sound a little bit like a ranting Jeremiah at the moment. I do think we have a sick culture. I usually want to talk about how wonderful the thing that we're building is. I want to focus on the good, the true, and the beautiful. But it is true that we're trying to do those things within a sick culture,
Yeah.
and that makes it swimming uphill, farming on rocky soil. Lots of different metaphors you could talk about there.
Yeah. So let's get into just this idea of kind of existing within a sick culture, but also in a sense not separating ourselves to the point where we're, living completely separate lives, but existing within the culture in a way that does not allow the culture to kind of control us or denigrate us. Um, Especially in the vision for St. Dunstan's, what do you guys envision education looking like for young boys becoming men that enables them to not just have a classical education, but actually participate in a culture that, uh, you know, allows them to exist within the sick culture, but bringing maybe a new culture to bear?
Yeah, yeah. So there's always a tension, I think, in a project like ours, and really in any church, between to what extent do you um, maybe a better way to say it is what elements of the culture do you just turn off and say we're not, as a church, we're not going to participate in those things. As a family, we're not going to be a part of that. What do you allow in? What filters do you put up? How thick are they? And also the matter of eventually, if you're thinking about it as a family, your children are going to leave your home. So how are you preparing them for when they've left the four walls of your home? So on the one hand, at St. Dunstan's, we're a school that has our boys will live under the rule of a temporary rule of what we're calling digital poverty, and I'm inspired by the Benedictine, or the broader monastic tradition of material poverty. Material poverty for the monks was not because material things are bad, but that they can be a distraction to a life of prayer, and so you renounce material ownership in order to dedicate your whole life to prayer. We would say similar things about the sort of digital world, including the one that we're sort of having this wonderful conversation in right now. It's not bad. Some of it's bad. A lot of it's bad, but it's not inherently bad. But it is a distraction for the kinds of things we want to do, and the costs of for our school culture of being sort of engaged in that world are greater than the benefits. And so we have chosen within our school, no screens, no phones, no computers. We're going to be a digital poverty school. We're also a boarding school, so there's that sort of sense of complete separation from the culture. We're on a 176 acre farm in a rural area. On the other hand, we're not although we have lots of monastic influences, and the sort of vision of ora et labora, prayer and work, is central to what we want to do. We are not a pseudo monastery. We're a kind of parish, essentially, is the vision. A microcosm of a parish is what we're looking for. And so our vision is to bring our faculty families on campus when we can build faculty housing. Thomas and his family already live on campus, and we're looking to bring more faculty on so that we can bring the boys into a faculty family culture. And eventually we'll also, our chapel on Sunday mornings will be open to the public. So we will functionally be planting a church at the same time as we start the school. And so we have folks from the surrounding community who will be part of that church with us. More important than those in terms of the kind of permeability to the culture, if you will, is that rather than choosing a traditional 9-month on, 3-month off rhythm for our school, for a number of reasons, including that we're a farm school, but more related to our pedagogy and our spiritual formation, the boys are going to spend 3 months on, 6 weeks off. So they'll be going home for 6 weeks out of every 3 months, essentially. And that rhythm for us of being in our community life together for a little over 2 months, and then being back in their family lives, their home lives, for 6 weeks, allows for a kind of back and forth that I think is really, really healthy. I always say, don't worry if you're worried that a St. Dunstan student is going to miss out on all the wonderful acedia and distraction that our culture has to offer. They won't miss out on that. They'll get that. What they'll get is what none of their peers are getting, which is life without digital distractions, a life oriented around prayer in the way that it's structured. And so they will have that opportunity. And this is the way that I, as the chaplain, I'll narrate it to them, is they get 12 opportunities over the course of their high school careers to decide what they want to take with them from St. Dunstan. So we'll sing the daily office every day. We'll sing morning and evening prayer together. And then you're going to go home for 6 weeks. And if you never crack open your prayer book, if you never pray, if you never read your Bible, then what you're saying is, when I leave St. Dunstan's, I'm not gonna pray, and I'm not gonna read my Bible. I'm not gonna take that with me. So you get 12 opportunities to decide what your life outside St. Dunstan's looks like. And part of that stems from my experiences working at a summer camp for 2 summers in the Colorado Rockies. That was by default essentially a digital poverty experience. You could get on your computer on Saturdays and Sundays, but the first summer that I did it, I didn't even bring my computer. So I didn't look at a computer for essentially 10, 12 weeks through the summer. Incredible experience, literal mountaintop experience. It was 9,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies. And then I came crashing back to earth when I went back to college and opened my laptop again and just got enmeshed in all of the meaninglessness of digital life. And of just sort of pop culture. I mean, I remember rambling a little bit here, but I remember getting home after that and watching I think I was watching, I don't even remember, some sports thing on TV. It might have been like college football season or something. And just watching the commercials and being kind of like blown away, because I had been essentially totally away from that stuff for 3 months, just blown away by how distracting and crazy they were. So anyway, all that to say that for us, not saying, all right, so you're not going to do that 3 times during your summer after freshman, summer after sophomore, summer after junior, and then sayonara. We're going to do that 12 times, and we're going to do it for these meaningful periods of time. After 6 weeks, you're going to have new habits, and they're going to be bad ones or good ones. And each time you get another chance to say, all right, what do I want to take with me? So that's part of the rhythm of our life together, is that sort of on-off pattern. Rambling a little bit, so I'll stop doing that.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing. There's another piece to this that I'm curious about, because I've noticed that you may have students that are enrolled in classical education or something like that, but the families themselves don't actually have a real commitment to that form of education. It's just like, oh, this seems like a good option, but there's no. So I guess my question, to try to not ramble myself, when you have a student that comes for 3 months and then they go home, how do you facilitate a kind of conversation that at least enables the family themselves to think about, like, is there a screening process that you guys go through? Is there a way that you partner with the actual families? Because I could see, a student coming 3 months, prayer every day, living kind of this monastic lifestyle, and then they go home and they want to live that kind of way, but the family doesn't pray. The TV's always on, things like that. Yeah. How do we kind of navigate that? Because I think without that family partnership, it kind of makes the actual lasting impact very difficult.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. One of the things I meant to say earlier, that when you asked sort of how do we get into this place where the culture of our schools doesn't really match up to the aspirations of the school. And one of the things I was going to say is that in this particular sense, classical education is a victim of its own success. And it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But 20 years ago, 20 years ago, a family that sent their kids to a classical school were, in the best possible way, like total weirdos. They were outsiders. They were kind of pioneers. And in some ways, it actually, one of the examples or comparisons I'll give is the organic movement. Back in the 70s and 80s, when organic first started, that was like a dirty hippie weirdo thing. And I was reading a long time ago a book that talked about the first organic produce that was sold sort of nationally, branded as organic, was it was a lettuce, a famous now lettuce brand in Costco. And it was really weird at first. It was like, why is Costco selling this sort of dirty hippie lettuce? And that was the kind of um, this sort of weirdo outsider movement. And one of the founders of the early organic movement talks about the first time that he saw an organic Pop-Tart. And he said, I knew it was over then. I knew the thing that we built, this kind of weirdo outsider hippie crunchy thing, was dead. It's been totally commodified, commercialized. And so I think about that with classical education. Like, what is the classical education version of the organic Pop-Tart? I have a couple different possible ideas. But I do think that what's happened is that classical education has been really successful. And the kinds of families that send their kids to classical schools today are normal American families, and that's not a bad thing either. It is a blessing that far more people have the opportunity to get a classical education today than they used to. That's a huge blessing. But the cost is that classical schools are no longer weird, and that self-selection of the weird, like the weirdest people in any given situation, meaning the most intense, the most dedicated, the most willing to sort of forsake the conventional and the normal, they all got together in their little classical school. That is not the truth for classical schools anymore. They are not that demographically different than the cities that they're in. And that's a success story, but it comes with the hazard that you no longer have the same sort of intensely mission fit families necessarily. We on the one hand, as a boarding school, for one thing, that will have a maximum of 60 students, so very small, that can come to us from anywhere on the planet. We need to find 60 boys at any given time on planet Earth who come from mission fit families. And so there's a certain sense in which we are cheating, that we are essentially avoiding the demographic pressures of your day school. So the day school I taught at needs 300 students, might be more than that now, 400 students, 600 students. They need a lot of students from a relatively small area, maybe about 200,000 people is the population they're drawing from. So they got to find 400 families that are willing to send their kids, and they do a great job. Again, I love that school. They made me a teacher. Again, still great leadership, great faculty, great families. But the kinds of what they have to do in terms of who they bring on is really different than us. We have to find 60 people on the planet. And so we are already, we're already seeing this in our we're launching this fall. We're calling it the Joshua program, which is a gap year for high school graduates, help them grow closer to Christ, grow in competence, and grow up. We're already kind of seeing, like, we're getting pioneering families, like families that are willing to do something a little weird, a little strange. It's the first iteration, where's my student going to live? Well, over there's a timber frame with some insulation on it, and we're on schedule to finish it by August. So he'll sleep in there. They say, and a lot of people are like, well, like I want to see a finished building. No, well, and whenever any of our prospective families come to visit, the student has to work on the building, in part so that when he moves in, he can say, I helped build that. But it's also part of the auditioning or interview process. So that's the first thing, is that we, by the nature of the thing, we're going to get really intense families, and that's a good thing. Comes with its own separate set of hazards, but we're not going to get we're not going to get the family that's like, well, just not sure the public schools really are aligning with our family's values anymore. I wonder, maybe we should send them 100 miles away to a boys' boarding school. That's not a right. So in part we get to cheat because of that. I do think, nevertheless, some of the families who are going to come to us because they recognize there's something that their boys need that they're not necessarily providing in the home. So I think we're still going to figure out those tensions together. I think we're, as much as possible, we want to invite the families into our life here to get them a sense of what the rhythm of life is here, and then charge them, help them to try to prepare their kids for the time when they're back. But the other thing I'll say, and I'm rambling once again, but the last thing I'll say is, although ideally the families, they would go home and they would experience that not as a rupture, right? They would experience it as a continuity of the culture that we're building here. And I think in a lot of cases that'll be true, that we're going to, like I said, we're going to have intense Christian families are going to be the ones who are going to send their kids. At the same time, the rupture, the disjuncture is not bad, because when they leave St. Dunstan's and they go off to whatever they do next, whether it's college or a trade school or the military, they are going to experience a massive rupture in their sort of culture. One of the things that we're doing, that we're going to be doing, is encouraging our graduates, if they can, to leave together in twos, but to consider the communities and the culture they're going to be going into, and not to view themselves as sort of lone individuals headed off, because that's the sociologist Peter of religion, Peter Berger, says that our worlds are built in conversation, and when conversation ceases, our worlds begin to shake. That we basically build our understanding of the world together in community, which I think is actually a very Christian concept. And when you change your community, then your world starts to shake. So we don't want people to leave as lone wolves, and at the same point in time, we also want them to experience some of that challenge, some of that difficulty in high school. That if I'm gonna say the daily office, for most of the cases, even in the Christian families, they're going to have to choose to do it themselves. If they're going to have to get up a little earlier if they're working, or they're going to have to take time out of their day and pray, and they're going to have to do it against the resistance of the kind of not nobody's going to be hostile to it in their family, Lord willing, but that won't be part of their family rhythms, and so they're going to have to carve that time out themselves. And I think that's actually really good practice for life after St. Dunstan's.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I want to talk a little bit about just this idea of the trades and training young men to work hard, not just intellectually, but also with their hands. I think I'm always blown away by how many people I encounter who are classically educated, who, when you sit down and have a conversation, they're whip smart, but when it comes to just practical day-to-day living, it's like men just don't have the training necessary to do a lot of the things that they used to be able to do. So to me, the idea of St. Dunstan's balancing this classical education, inspiring the intellect to think deeply with this hands-on work, is a very incarnational view of the world, view of masculinity. And so, yeah, just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I'll shamelessly plug myself again. Thomas and I have a piece coming out. I don't know when this will come out, but it's coming out tentatively Wednesday, June 18th, at Mere Orthodoxy, called Common Arts That Matter. And it's specifically about the building arts in education and in community formation. And part of the premise of the piece, which is part of the premise of St. Dunstan's, is that the part of what has near the heart of a lot of the ills in our culture is disembodiment, that we have been divorced from our bodies. And so if you think about sexual confusion, even greed in certain senses, our food systems, all sorts of different areas, you could say that the ill that's here is a sort of divorce from creation, which begins with a divorce from my own body. That we live in a world where our bodies are increasingly irrelevant to the work that we do. Therefore, we experience our bodies and bodily difference almost as foreign objects. We don't inhabit them in the way that we ought. There's all sorts of examples of this, but Jonathan Haidt, in his mega bestseller last year, The Anxious Generation, the subtitle was now I can't remember the subtitle, but he talks about the shift from a play-based to a screen-based or a phone-based childhood. We broadly, but us specifically, we love to rant about the deadliness of smartphones, and I'm totally on board with that. They're toxic, but they are existing within a broader shift away from one of the things we say in the piece is that just by being a human body at work and play in the world, our forebears would have a better understanding of embodiment and creatureliness than almost anyone today, because we're so divorced from our bodies. And the specifically with the common arts are defined as the means by which we meet our material needs in the world. So how do you get shelter? Through the building arts. How do you get food? Through agriculture and cooking and hunting. How do you get clothing? Through weaving and that kind of thing. So there's different lists of common arts, but it's essentially all the things that meet our material needs. And one of our premises is that we have offloaded virtually all of that, virtually all of the common arts to giant corporations, experts, and robots, basically. So
Yeah.
almost everything. One of the examples is just navigation. That we have phones, so we don't have to read maps, much less a compass, much less the stars. And so there's a progressive move away from a kind of embodied reality into a disembodiment. It's all there's all sorts of efficiencies and good things that come along with that. I know I sound like a complete romantic antiquarian, and in some ways we are a romantic project for sure. Um, and so, but we're not saying all that's bad, but we are saying there are costs to that. And the cost is essentially that you have put more and more artifice between you and created reality. Um, and that's, you and I are in reality right now. The screen that I'm looking at is part of reality too, but um, it can be a distraction from reality as God created it to be. And so our whole project, our whole program is designed to bring boys into a more direct encounter with reality. So, for instance, I'm in it right now. I'm in a timber frame building. I don't know how well you can see it, but we built this with Thomas and me at the time. We were the full-time employees and about 100 volunteers. So it was a proof of concept for us that we could build the way that we want to build. Um, and we wanted to see how can we train particularly young men and boys to build with us, but lots of other folks as well. So this was kind of our little mini proof of concept. But the reason that we've settled on timber framing is because it's the trade that we believe brings the tradesman into the most intimate connection, the most direct connection with things as they're created to be. So when you timber frame in particular, we're using a lot of lumber from local mills, but we also have our own sawmill that we're using for some of it, using our own forests, following our own timber management plan. So we have to select trees based on our timber management plan. So it has to be a tree that fits our uses and our needs, but it also has to fit our timber management plan. So you're attending not just to, all right, here are the plans with the 2x4s that we bought from Home Depot, and this is where they go. But you're thinking, all right, we need this timber for our project. So we need to go find the tree that fits the timber, but also has to fit the ecology that we're trying to bring about in this particular forest. So there's a kind of deep sense of the interconnectedness of reality. And then when you bring down the tree, so you're thinking about species, you're thinking about the individual tree, then you got to mill the thing and then cut it into the particular timber that you need, the particular joinery that you need. And that requires an attention to things that is not required by conventional stick frame construction. The example that I give is that you can replace a 2x4 with a plastic PVC 2x4, and in most cases and for most uses, it's identical. There's no interchangeability in the kind of timber framing that we're doing. You actually have to attend to things as they're created to be. So it's a useful trade. It teaches you a lot about a lot of things, but it also brings you into kind of a deeper connection with reality. And so we want the boys in the trades not only to be given a vision for other things other than college that could potentially be a good life, but also we want them to be brought back into embodiment, brought back into their bodies, and brought back into understanding themselves as creatures of a good creator.
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who would object and say, well, yeah, that might be useful, but we live in a post-industrial revolution world. Most jobs nowadays are digital or this or that. What's the real use in training boys through this particular trade?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a few things to say. One is that currently, the just crassly economically, and it is crass to think just about sort of like making money. And on the other hand, sometimes with classical educators, I want to say, well, I mean, they are going to need to support a family, right? Like that's part of what we say is that every young man essentially has three vocations. They have a vocation to family, so certainly as a son, probably as a brother, and probably as a father. Eventually, they have a vocation to fatherhood, or at least to sonship and brotherhood that they have to fulfill in their family. They have a vocation to the church that they have to fulfill. It might be an ordained ministry, it might not. but they have to fulfill their vocation of ministry to the church, and they have a vocation in their community, which is that most people who are called to be useful members of a community, and in particular to be economically useful members. And so classical schools don't have to do job training, and I think in general that's a mistake for your average day school to try to do that kind of stuff. But they do need to be thinking about the kinds of people they're producing, and whether they can be sort of useful in the world and useful to their communities. I would say that part of our argument is similar to classical schools, where most, classical education is quote unquote useful. Number one, because it leads to human flourishing, and that's the most practical thing that you can possibly imagine. But then you would say secondarily, because the kinds of thinking that you learn in a classical education are broadly applicable. So that if you learn to code, you've learned to code. If you learn logic, you have learned how to do anything in a certain sense. So, we had there's a software engineer in our sort of community, and I asked him, if you wanted your boys to become software engineers, what's the number one thing they should learn in high school? And his answer was logic. He said, the language of coding, anyone can learn it. The difference between somebody who's good at it and somebody who's not is really about how developed is their logical thinking. And so there's a kind of malleability in classical education that's useful. I think the same thing is true to some extent in the trades, that there's a kind of problem solving, there's a kind of thinking that happens in trades work that is broadly applicable to problem solving in a lot of different contexts. Matthew Crawford talks about this in Shop Class's Soulcraft. Mm-hmm. The other truth is that the trades are an area of economic need and growth. Most of them, the average age of tradesmen in most trades is upper 50s, if not 60s. I think plumbers, it's something like 63. Electricians, it's upper 50s. And plumbers, electricians, all sorts of tradesmen are in very short supply and growing shorter. So there's a kind of economic argument there of utility that I think is worth considering. But the bigger point, ultimately, we think, is that, again, on a society-wide scale, the aimlessness and the kind of pointlessness and emptiness, of modern life is in a lot of cases a result of disembodiment. And the trades, one of the benefits of fasting, the traditional Christian practice of fasting, is that it reminds you have a body. It's hard to forget that you have a body when you're hungry. And I think that's one of the ancillary benefits of fasting. And likewise, when you smash your thumb with a hammer, it's hard to forget that you have this body that you're intended to care for. And so there's just so much distraction and wasted time and wasted money and wasted brilliance out in the world. And so we want to give boys a sort of undistracted life, a kind of monistic life of prayer. So I think that's a little bit of a rambling answer, but maybe those are some of the ways I'd answer that.
So I can see, this is a beautiful, wonderful thing that you're doing, but there are so many young boys and men that just don't have access to that kind of thing and do feel suffocated by the world. I myself can say that. I live in a cookie cutter neighborhood in a community that's not set up with the church as its center. Everything's industrialized, and at times it really can be challenging not to just get sucked into all the media and all just the oppression, for lack of a better word. What are some just practical ways in which, young men, or even, fully adult men who feel like they're not able to escape the kind of world that has been crafted around them, what are some ways that they can practically begin to pursue something like this in their own contexts?
Right. Yeah. I mean, in most cases, the question is, how do you sort of remediate the day-to-day, one's day-to-day existence? And I have sort of two answers. One is that one is the sort of revolutionary answer, in a sense that we actually need a sort of, and this is the argument we make in that Mere Orthodoxy piece, which is that we need a much bigger rethinking of the way that we exist and live together. One example Thomas gives is a school in a place that will both go unnamed that needed to replace a roof, and because it was leaking a little bit. And the headmaster was distraught because he had just finished a fundraising campaign for something, and now he had to pay, I forget what it was, something like $200,000 to replace this roof. And Thomas, who, again, is a commercial contractor, was like, whoa, how is it that expensive? Like, what kind of a roof is it? How big is it? And he says, it's not that big. Like, steep is the pitch. It's not that steep. What's the material? It's just a metal roof. But that was the sort of going rate in that particular community. So Thomas said, well, why don't you, naively, you've got to have people in your community that you could get the men from your school to put that thing up in a weekend over the summer. And it would what, cost you $10,000 or something. And there was in a group, he was at a conference, group of headmasters, and they all laughed at him. Like, what are you talking about? And in part, you can't do that because that's illegal. It's a commercial building. You can't just get up. And this is part of the piece, is that we have a systems that prevent us from doing things ourselves that we should be able to do ourselves. It's illegal to do most of those things. But he still could have probably found a commercial contractor willing to take on the liability and do it. Or maybe he couldn't have, and that's the problem, is that we actually need to consider, are there things that we can do together in our communities, in our schools, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, that we can choose not to outsource, especially in times like that when you can save, $150,000 or something. But even not, like, are there things we should do for ourselves because we should do them for ourselves, even if it's cheaper and more efficient to let Walmart do it for us? And so I think that's the sort of the big revolutionary question. Maybe our churches and our schools ought to be thinking bigger. I think on a smaller scale, there's a few things that anybody can fast. And I do think that actually, even though it sounds very different, I think the Christian discipline of fasting, there's a reason it's universal, even outside Christianity. It's a universal spiritual practice in pretty much any old religion, because it has particular benefits. And I think part of those benefits is a restoration of embodiment. So that would be the first thing is next Lent, don't do a metaphorical fast, do a real fast. And you don't have to do something super intense. You don't have to, do the like Exodus 90 thing in the Roman Catholic Church or whatever. I mean, you can. I'm not telling you can't do that, but you can just do the normal way that the church fasts in community, and that is a powerful thing. And the other beauty of having a traditional fast that your church is doing together is that you're doing it together. I think that's really beneficial. I think it'd be really beneficial for most churches to, again, you got to be really. You don't want to do anything that turns people away from the Eucharist, but encouraging your parishioners in ways that you can to restore the traditional Sunday morning fast. It's hard to do. Being hungry it's hard enough for families to get their kids and wrangle their kids, and to be doing it when you're hungry and grouchy is not great. So, you got to be careful with that. But if it were sort of the norm that in a parish, everybody's fasting from Saturday night until you take communion, I think there's something you're doing that you're bringing back together, that you're bringing a community back together, and you're bringing yourself through embodiment. So I think that's actually one thing. I think the second thing, I think everybody should garden. It sounds silly, but there's really, I don't know that there might be maybe some apartments in Hong Kong where you can't possibly have a potted plant. But I think pretty much almost anyone in any place in the United States of America can grow things for themselves. And so I think having some plants, especially plants that you eat, I think is actually really beneficial too. It's very small, but it's a first step back towards re-embodiment, towards experiencing, God's good reality. One example I often give is that when I was teaching 8th graders, and I mentioned that the victory gardens of World War II that was the last time that the majority of Americans grew any of their own food, was during World War II. And one of my students says, "We've got a garden in our backyard." And I say, "Oh my goodness, we have a garden in our backyard. What are you growing? Da, 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 da. What are you growing?" "Oh, we're growing tomatoes right now." And this one girl says, "Wait, you're telling me you eat tomatoes from your backyard, like in the ground next to the dirt. And me and the other girl who had the garden and a couple of the other students kind of look over at her and we realize, oh my goodness, she has no concept of where a tomato comes from. Or maybe she
Yeah.
does, and her tomatoes are all grown hydroponically. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
that was but it was this sort of astonishing moment of here's an eighth grade girl who's not dumb. She just is totally divorced from food.
Mm,
Has no idea where food comes from or what it is. It just appears on her plate, And so
right.
those kinds of gardening is a great way to sort of move back. And so into embodiment. So I think that anything we can do at the edges to sort of restore a sense of ourselves as embodied is really valuable. Exercise is great too, but especially, some exercise that's useful. So if you can build something and get some exercise, that's really useful too. The other thing I'd say is that almost every church out there probably has some old guy who loves building things, in his garage. And most of those old guys, not all, but most of those old guys would love it if the 12, 13, 14-year-old boys in the church were brought over to learn how to build with them. And so I would say, like,
Yeah.
looking around at your church community, your school community, and you say, okay, because this is the other thing Thomas will always talk about is that apprenticeship in the trades, mentorship in the trades, is one of the most powerful ways of men teaching boys what it is to be a man.
Mm,
And so
yeah.
when I say trades, and I'm thinking here broadly, not necessarily vocationally, but like, the old guy who loves woodworking in his garage, he has an opportunity to invite boys and young men into that, and then through working together to help confer a sense of mature manhood onto young men. So I think that those are some good possibilities.
Yeah. There's this theme that you've been just kind of talking about throughout our whole conversation that I want to dig into a little bit more, and that's the idea of community. Obviously, the church is a community, and the structure of St. Dunstan's is this idea of community. Why is that so important to what we've been discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, well, there's a lot of things you could say there, but um, rejecting the sort of enlightenment vision that we are the fundamental building block of society is the individual.
Yeah.
The fundamental building block of society really is the family, and then the family within a community. That when you recognize, part of that recognition is recognizing the givenness of reality, that you're not fundamentally an autonomous choosing individual, but rather, a son or a daughter who's been born into a family that you didn't choose. You're helpless for much of for years. You are essentially helpless without your family, and that family also is embedded in a community that it didn't necessarily choose. That's less true now than it was 100, 200 years ago, given mobility. But nevertheless, there's a kind of greater community that you're a part of, and each of those, I think, teaches us that ultimately the sort of vision of family membership and political membership, community membership, neighborhood membership, those are all shadows of the church, which is the organism, the sacramental organism in which every Christian is a member, a part of that body. And so we are not meant to live as individuals; we're meant to live in community. And um, and so, the deeper and the thicker your community is, I think the closer that community's, what I would call it, sort of iconographic purpose, which is to point you into the community that is the body of Christ, the better it can do. Now, it comes with its own set of hazards. I don't. This is, maybe at this point this might actually be a deep cut, but the rise and fall of Mars Hill, the rise and fall of, is that what it's called? Rise and fall of Mars Hill.
I
The
think so.
Mark Driscoll
Yeah.
podcast that was, everybody was listening to 5 years ago. Um, One of the things they kept saying about Mars Hill that I there are lots of reasons to critique Mark Driscoll, and the podcast did a good job of a lot of them. But they kept talking about how hard it was for people to leave that church because that was their whole community. And they would say it with this, that the hosts would say it as though that makes it sort of a cult, like it's sort of
Mm,
cultish if it's hard to leave your church. And I remember thinking the problem was that the thick community at Mars Hill appears to have been really unhealthy. But the problem wasn't that they had a thick community. That's actually like incredibly admirable that in a city like Seattle, you could build a thick community in a megachurch. I mean, it's kind of mind blowing. There's probably some things to be learned there. Um, um, but thick community does come with its hazards. At St. Dunstan's, we talk about this all the time. My coworkers and I, that when it is fully operational, our workplace is going to be our neighborhood, is going to be our church, and that kind of like Venn diagram overlap where it's all the same thing. I think that raises the sort of ceiling for what a community can be, for the depth of community that you can have. But it also comes with an enormous amount of hazards. We always talk about, when we were both teaching at the same day school, there were a few people on faculty that we didn't really get along with, but when you're at a relatively large day school and there's, 30 teachers in the building, you can pretty much avoid the one or two teachers that you don't get along with, and you can smile and be cordial in the hallway because that's all you have to be on a day-to-day basis. But when you go to church with them, and when you live in the same neighborhood as them, and when you instead of having 30 teachers, you have 10 to 12 full-time faculty, which is our vision, then that creates an enormous pressure to have a healthy community. And there are hazards that come along with that kind of intimacy, but I think those are the inherent hazards. Those are the downsides of a good thing, if that makes sense. And so,
Right.
again, if we are ultimately members of a body, which is the body of Christ, the sort of the vision of any given community is a echo or an anticipation or a foreshadowing, an icon of that, I would say. And so that's why I think healthy communities really matter.
Yeah. I have two more bigger questions, so take your time with these. The first would be just, I've listened to people like Jonathan Peugeot and others discuss the way in which communities have changed from having the church at the very center and everything kind of built around that to now, you're lucky if a town even has a church, and if that church is central. And so you can still go to a lot of these older towns and villages where the church is the very centerpiece and everything's kind of built around that. As we've moved further and further away from that, I think there is a deep longing in a lot of people for something like that, even if they can't name it as such. How would you encourage Christian families living in a community to begin to, really impact change within their community towards something like that again? Because I think the difficulty can be, you might have Christian families that attend a local church together and they have a very tight-knit community, but it's just them. Their community kind of is existing in this other world, this other dimension. And the idea is, how do we bridge the gap where we can actually bring change to our communities to encourage maybe, hey, there's something to this. We should move back in this direction.
Yeah. 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 It's interesting because, sometimes people will talk about the church as an alternative polis, an alternative community, a sort of alternative politics. And I think that's true. But at the same point in time, the church is within a polis as well. And, to go back kind of to the beginning, St. Paul says, do good unto all men, particularly the brethren. I'm totally butchering that scriptural quotations from Galatians. But I think you know which one I'm talking about. And that sort of order of priority suggests that, yeah, actually your first priority is the parish. And it is, you don't have anything to offer to the world if you have an unhealthy church. And so your first priority is to worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness, but then to make that church, following Acts 2:42, to be a place of apostolic fellowship. And so, one of the things that in my capacity at St. Dunstan's, I've traveled to a lot of different churches. I'm preaching at, 2 different ACNA churches in the next month, and have, preached at a dozen or so, or preached or presented at 2 dozen, probably churches in the past year and a half. And one of the things that I'm attentive to when I'm in a place is, do the people at this church want to be around each other? And you can you can't know that from a visit for sure, like you can, but you can make a pretty decent educated guess. And probably most of the time you'll be right. If you just attend and you kind of look around, you say, do these people like each other and do they want to be around each other? You could figure that out typically, within about 15 minutes after church. If everybody's in their cars gone, then you don't really have a community there. You have a church, but it's not fully living. But if you see the place where you see the more than one time the people who are standing in the parking lot and their cars are like right there, but they're there for an hour talking, you think, okay, yeah, something good is happening here. So I think the first thing is, if you don't have a church where people want to be around each other, then you have nothing to invite your neighbors into and nothing to invite your community into, and you have nothing sort of from which to bring about change. So I think that's the first thing, is that actually, you have to attend to the kind of community that you have. At the same point in time, other folks would say, sorry, I'm distracted by the crane out the window, wondering what they're doing. At the same point in time, you can't be totally turned inward. You have to recognize that you as a community have a vocation and a ministry in the world as well. And so that's part of how you have a healthy community, is by being partly turned outward as well. So, I have two, I'm sounding a little bit incoherent because I think there are these two tensions that I haven't fully resolved. And the one is that, as I was saying before, that you actually have an obligation to the polis and to the culture. You cannot care for your own children and your church, as a clergyman, if you are indifferent to the community, the neighborhood that they're in. You actually have a vested interest in seeing it be made healthier, because that's the water that your parishioners are swimming in, that your children are swimming in. And on the other hand, that can be a distraction from the hard work of caring for your own family, for your own children, and caring for your own flock. And so that's kind of the tension, to say, all right, you are in a place as a church that you have a certain duty, a certain responsibility to care for. You don't get to be a kind of quietist who's totally indifferent to what's happening outside the walls of your parish. And on the other hand, that can never distract you from the care for the church itself. And I think that throughout the Old and the New Testament, that vision, the tagline from, I haven't thought about this podcast in like a year, but now I've thought about it twice. The tagline from The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, they talked about Jesus as the one who leaves the 99 for the one, using the parable of the Good Shepherd. And there's a lot of truth to that. He does leave the 99 for the one, but he brings the one back to the 99. And Jesus also, leaves the 99 for the 12. Like, there's a certain sense in which Jesus's own life and ministry mostly involved him hanging out with his 12 closest followers. And yes, bringing other people, inviting other people in, but his actual ministry was to the 12 most directly. And so I think there's a kind of the way that a parish priest fundamentally, I think anyway, and I served 3 years in parish ministry, but not as a rector. So I say all these things with recognizing that I don't have a right to, but my sense of the way that this works, from reading Thornton, from talking to other folks, is that a rector's first responsibility is to care for his own parishioners, and then to charge them. They have a vocation of ministry. They depart in peace, carrying with them the body of Christ into the world, and their vocation then is to sort of live Christ in their communities. But I do think, again, when I get a little bit more radical, I think, people ought to, when they're thinking about a job, they ought to consider what church they're going to go to before they move. And then they ought to try to, if they can, and this is so difficult these days, but buy a house near that church. And families, to the extent they can, ought to be trying to live together in proximity to their church. The church I served at in Orlando, in a lot of ways, I thought of the sort of Orlando metropolitan area as this immovable rock that was so hard to build community, because you have to navigate Orlando traffic, anytime you want to build community. It made it really hard. And yet a lot of the families in that church made a choice to live in certain neighborhoods near each other. And so you could draw a little 10-minute line around the church, and you found a whole lot of the young families in the church living in that area, quite deliberately. And so even in this relative, like there's Atlanta's harder, but Orlando's pretty hard, as far as a place to build a local culture. There's some really good things that folks down at St. Albans and Oviedo have done to kind of build deeper community together.
Yeah, very cool. My last big question is, you have a boy who wants to become a man. In the vision of St. Dunstan's, what does it mean for a boy to become a man?
Yeah, man, great question. Yeah, so one of the things that we'll say, following in part a guy named Jason Craig, who leads a ministry called Fraternists, Roman Catholic. He has a great book called Leaving Boyhood Behind. I've read the original edition. He just came out with a new revised edition, so I just started that. And it's something like Reclaiming the Gift of Manhood and Rites of Passage. That's the subtitle. Excellent book. And he says, quoting somebody else, that although maleness is biological, masculinity is conferred. Socially conferred even. And now if you could be hearing sort of like, postmodern left wing, stuff if you want to, but that's not what it means. What it means is that that a community of men teach boys what manhood is. It is not something you just discover by getting biologically older. And so that's the first thing to say, is that a community actually has to confer manhood. And this is what's so difficult, is that a dad can't do it alone. I don't think a dad is more important than any other man in his son's life, but he can't do it alone. He needs other men, and he needs women too, for sure. I mean, you need a full community. But traditionally, in the sort of traditional rites of passage that almost every culture has undergone, and that Jason Craig argues, and I agree with him, and have stolen his argument many times. Jesus in Luke chapter 2, in the story of the boy Jesus in the temple, he also goes through a rite of passage by being temporarily removed from his family, by being initiated into manhood through challenge. And in a lot of cases, this challenge has a kind of funereal quality. The boy is dying so that a man can emerge. And then he is assimilated into an adult vocation and responsibilities, and recognized as such by the broader community. And so another sort of metaphorical example is that in marriage, the husband and wife are taken out of their families. They are joined together, and they become a new family that the community recognizes. There's suddenly a new family here that wasn't before. Baptism is the ultimate rite of passage. The child is removed from the literal arms of the domestic family. He's buried in baptism, and then he is assimilated into the people of God as a member of a new family. And so all these things are echoed or anticipated in traditional rites of passage, where boys sometime between the age of 12 and 15 are removed from the domestic family. They go through a period of initiation, a period of challenge that often has funereal, death-like qualities, and then they're sort of assimilated into a community. And so this all to some extent, this stuff happens naturally because adolescence is a time of passage from childhood to, so an adolescent has been removed from childhood. That's what it means to be an adolescent. Puberty kicked you out of childhood. You're not a kid anymore. You're not a child anymore, and you're going through the painful process of becoming an adult. And so that sort of threefold rite of passage is just what it means to grow up. But there's ways that the men in a community can recognize it as something that's happening, and can kind of usher boys through it through the kinds of experiences that challenge them to grow into their manhood. You can do it a million thousand different ways. One of our sort of lines is that if you want to think about creating a rite of passage that honors that reality that's already happening, then what you do is you invite a boy into a manly responsibility, something that's got some degree of risk or difficulty, especially, and some degree of utility to a community. You teach the boy how to do it. He does it at the elbow of a mentor, and then he does it. and gets recognized for it by a community. So the classic example that we do here is dropping one of these giant red oak trees in our oak forest that we need for our building project. So it's useful, but it's very scary. It's genuinely dangerous. It's not. We do it carefully. Thomas and Morgan, my coworkers, are incredible chainsaw instructors, and they do a great job of teaching the boys how to do it. It's a very controlled environment. And we put up flags and for the boys to try to aim the tree at. And I think the worst score was about 6 feet wide of the flag, which is pretty well controlled. So in other words, it's not actually all that dangerous. Driving to St. Dunstan's is more dangerous than doing it, but it is dangerous. Chainsaws are dangerous. You can't get away from that. And then the other thing is and it's scary, like I say for personal experience, when you're making that last back cut and you're looking up at the tree and you're seeing it start to shake and you think, if I do this wrong, I am going to die. Now, again, it's not that dangerous. In the same way, it's more dangerous, in your car, you just don't think about it. If I look at my phone at the wrong time, I will die. You're just used to it. Right. But you're not used to it, with a tree like that when you're learning. And then when the tree goes down, makes a massive whoomp sound, and you can feel the forest floor shake. Everybody who's there says, okay, you just did something amazing. And so there's a kind of automatic community authorization that you did something risky, scary, useful, and meaningful. And so anyway, I think you can, the way that I think about it is, all right, what is something, there's a last thing actually I'll say is there's a guy named Joe Davis, who's a sociologist at UVA, and he talks about how we ask young people in our society to do things that nobody can do, which is to define your own existence by turning inward. Like, just find yourself by looking inward. Like, it's not a developmentally appropriate challenge for any human being. But we don't let teenagers do things that are developmentally appropriate, like operate power tools. That was the example he gave. Is that operating a power tool is dangerous and risky, and so therefore we say teenagers can't do it. Well, that's crazy. They can do it. There are risks. You can minimize the risks by being careful and thoughtful, but the risks are real, and that's part of what makes it valuable to do, because a 14-year-old is developmentally ready for that risk. A 14-year-old ought to be, again, under the guidance of mentors, should be able to use a skill saw and a table saw. And not letting him do that is essentially sort of treating him like a child when he's not a child anymore. So anyway, rant.
Yeah. Speak to for just a moment to those boys. I'm gonna use the language of boys who are in their mid to late 20s, maybe even into their 30s, and they just have not, because of the decay of the family, the decay of the culture, the decay of the community, they have not had the opportunity in their formative years to experience any sort of real rite of passage. And they feel that there's a real hunger going, man, I'm a boy. I don't have skills. I don't have men. I never had a father figure in my life that showed me what it means to be a man. Is it too late for them? Are they forever bound to being a boy?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is no. But they have to find a way to grow up. I mean, I had a good family and a good school, and but I was, and a lot of this was my own fault. I'm not blaming anyone else per se, but I was definitely coddled a little bit, and I got away with nothing like terrible, but just silly things like I didn't turn a paper like a paper for school. I didn't. After my first semester of my freshman year, I don't think I turned a single paper in on time until my senior year of college. And I faced very little consequences for that most of the time. And I get it. It's like, I wrote good papers, and most of the time professors are like, I don't really care that you turned it in an hour late, or 2 hours later. But there was a kind of, I look at that in hindsight as a sort of infantilization in a very small way, that I was not expected to be, they said, you need to do this. I didn't do it, and they rarely did I actually see the consequences that were promised to me. So all to say, I got away with being really immature for a really long time, I think, in certain respects. And for me, um, the wake up, grow up call, honestly, was when I was probably when I was number one was teaching, um, was like not naturally automatically good at it, and that was a new thing for me. But then really it was the sort of crucible when I got married, I had a baby, and I went to seminary and was teaching full time at the same time. That experience, it was like in the middle of it where I was like, oh, this is actually what it means to be a grown up, is to sort of do the things that I said I was going to do and to juggle these difficult things, and as best I can not to sort of whine and cry about it. So for me, it was you know, I didn't I would say I was sort of like I was close to being one of those sort of 20 something, not quite grown ups. And likewise, I always say, when I got married, I think my father-in-law was perfectly happy with me as a son-in-law, except for the fact that I was so useless. Like I could teach. By that time, I was a decent teacher, and I could read books and write papers. But I had no sort of ability to work on my house in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
So I was
Yeah.
very much a late comer to the project, and
Yeah.
during part of it was my father-in-law consistently saying, "No, I'm going to come to your house, and I'm going to I'm going to get 5 projects 65% done, and then I'm going to leave, and you're going to have 5 unfinished projects that are mostly there, but you're going to actually have to do it."
Mm.
Part of it was that we accidentally bought. This is like as recently as COVID. Like in 2020, we bought a fixer upper. We didn't want to buy a fixer upper, but it was COVID, and we bought what we could. And then I had this massive project on my hands that I had to figure out how to do. But I had a father-in-law and a brother-in-law, who came and helped me get started on it and figure out what I was doing. So I had a mentorship from people who were more competent than me that I could call on to help me out. I look at my own sort of story as the thing I would say to those 20 something year old is, and it all depends upon the particular person, but you need to be doing things that are difficult. So probably most of those sort of aimless 20 something year olds have a life that's too easy and that's too online. And so
Yeah.
you need to figure out how to get offline and how to challenge yourself to do something that's difficult. I mean, that's one of the things. I was fortunate enough that the difficulty, found me by virtue of me getting married and then having this call to
Yeah.
ministry that I didn't expect. So I wouldn't say, I say this knowing that I didn't like have the internal, like I must get serious and pull my life together. It was sort of forced upon me, by circumstances, which was always the way it used to be in our culture. This is, again, the fact that our culture, that if you want to be a responsible grown adult man, you have to work really hard against our culture, is something that I think is genuinely,
Yeah.
um, new. I mean, there were all sorts of hazards to masculinity 200 years ago, whatever. I'm not, I don't want to be naive about the past, but there's a certain sort of new difficulty. So yeah, I mean, I think find something that's difficult and challenging to do, and do it. And then, not to echo other people, but go to church, go to church consistently, become an Anglican and say the daily office.
Yeah.
That is a great challenge. Structure your life, build a rule of life. Go find your rector and help, and ask him what kind of a rule of life can you build. So I think that kind of structure, order, and challenge are the means towards sort of growth and maturity for overgrown boys like I was when I was 24, and like a lot of 24-year-olds are today.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think too, just to kind of reiterate what you're saying, but to add something, if there's a real desire and a real knowledge that there's something lacking, part of the process of becoming a man is actually taking the necessary action to change that, not being satisfied with this sense of something's wrong, but I'm not going to go out. So I'll give an example, because similar to you, I think I grew up where I was coddled maybe a little bit more than I should have. Skills that I didn't have, I just didn't learn. And to be super vulnerable, 2 weeks ago, I went, you know what? I've been paying for oil changes my whole life. I don't know how to change oil. My brother-in-law, he does. So we were out in Colorado a week ago, and I said, hey, teach me how to change the oil to my car so I don't have to pay for it anymore. And he did. It was a simple process, and I felt like it was a victory in my masculinity, where I went, now I know how to do something that's important, that's easy, that can save me and my family money, and that I can potentially use as a service to others who don't know how to do this either. And so just as a practical, I think very simple things like that. If there's something you don't know how to do, find somebody who does, learn from them, and over time, that's going to not only increase your confidence, but it's also going to uh, demonstrate that you can recognize deficiencies within yourself and then take the necessary action to fix that.
Right.
Um,
Right. And this is where, you know, one of the silver linings of YouTube is that there's almost no project that
right.
you cannot watch a YouTube video to teach you how to do. Um, the downside. So I love your story because you found the person who knows how to do it. Number one, it's easier than a YouTube video. Believe it, it's not easier in the sense that like you have to go find the person or whatever, but to have the actual expert, because it's a lot of times you run into things, you need the expert there, the mentor there to make it most easy. And that's also where you build a relation with somebody. So the sort of first encouragement is find the person who knows how to do it and ask them to teach you rather than going to YouTube. But at the same point in time, YouTube is that is a silver lining of our sort of culture here, is that you can go find, this is terrible, but you can go find an online mentor to teach you how to what is it? There's this particular kind of saw that I can't remember it. I don't have a brain today, but for making moldings that you're putting together, you can just do the 45-degree angle, smush them together, and use a bunch of caulk, or you can use a coping saw. There it is. And this is one of those things. My father-in-law, I'm working on the trim in my old house. And my father-in-law is like, you really should use a coping saw. It's going to look way better than those cuts that you are. So I went and I bought you a coping saw, which is not a power tool. It's a little, it's very cheap. There it is. You need to use that. And then he left, and went back across the country. And I was like, well, okay, I have the coping saw now, but I don't have the man to teach me how to use it. So then I went and found on YouTube, and about 5 minutes later, I learned how to use a coping saw. So yeah, I mean, I think there are all, and this is again another example. Just that. Well, I won't go into the example, but there's just so much learned helplessness
Yeah.
to
Right.
modern life. Like I couldn't possibly fix this. I just have to call a professional to do it for me. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes you just don't have the time to. Like we're probably going to hire a framing crew to frame out our dormer windows up here because for a variety of reasons we ended up we have a timber frame engineer and an architect, and each thought the other person was designing the gable windows. So nobody designed the gable windows. So now we have a timber frame where we have to kind of figure it out as we go. So we're probably going to hire a professional crew to do that for us. We can do it, but it will probably slow us down by like a week. So we're outsourcing it. So
Right.
you always have to sort of same with I did learn how to change my oil, but I usually outsource it to Valvoline 5-minute oil changes.
Yeah.
So everybody, you have to make the sort of compromises. But I think
Right.
choosing to do the things for yourself that you can do when you can is the right thing to do. And I absolutely, I think those little things, and there's so many that are really small that are not hard to do. And that's when you sort of grow and you get a little less learned helplessness. So you're like, all right, I conquered this one very small project. Now I have the confidence to do the next one and the next one and the next one. And then at some certain point, one of the things we say is we want the boys who graduate from St. Dunstan's and the young men who come out of our Joshua program, we want them to know how to build and maintain a homestead, not so that they can be independent of others, but so that they can be dependable. We want to
Yes.
send out these 18-year-old young men who then are going to be the young man in their church or in their college or in their communities where people know, hey, you know what, Josh knows how to change those. That's the guy who knows how to do that kind of stuff, and then he becomes a kind of source of mentorship for other people around him. That's the hope.
Right. That's awesome. Well, Father, thank you so much for your time. It was great chatting with you, and I think what's going on with St. Dunstan's Academy is great work, and I hope for the best and that it flourishes and can be a source of encouragement to a lot of young men who need that kind of thing. Just the last thing I'm going to ask is if there's those watching who are really excited about what's going on and want to get more involved, whether that be to support financially or to even consider sending their kids to, what are ways in which people can find it and support it?
Yeah. So our website's the main thing, stdunstonsacademy.org. If you search St. Dunstan's Academy, you'll find us. You will find from there that you can keep up with what we're doing through our development journal, which is on the homepage. We send out a newsletter every other month. You can sign up for that there. So we try not to fill your inbox more than once a month, and the newsletter comes out every other month. And There's a place to donate there as well. We've been incredibly blessed with good fundraising, but we have a lot of money we need to raise to continue and to finish building our campus. So we certainly need that as well. So those are probably the best ways. My email is mperkins at stdunstonsacademy.org. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm always happy to chat. So thank you for the podcast and for some really excellent questions that are very thoughtful and worth pondering. Appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, well, thank you. Likewise.
Thanks.